Every fall, our town held a cornfield festival on the outskirts of town, right at the edge of a sprawling farm. The corn maze was its main attraction, especially at night. Families and kids would walk through, laughing and trying to find their way out. But by the time I was a teenager, the maze had taken on a darker tone. There were whispers, rumors of a shadowy figure that haunted the maze. People brushed it off as a Halloween scare tactic, something to make the maze feel more exciting. But then last October, my friends and I found out that it was real. We decided to sneak into the maze after it closed for the night, hoping to explore it alone and maybe scare each other along the way. With only flashlights, we ventured in, laughing and calling out as we wove through the narrow paths of towering cornstalks. It wasn't long before we started hearing things, soft, shuffling footsteps a few rows over. We'd stop, go silent, and listen, but there was nothing there. Then we heard whispers. I glanced at my friend Megan, but she looked as terrified as I felt. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We huddled together, shining our flashlights into the maze, but the lights barely pierced the dense rows of corn. Just as we were about to move on, we saw him, a dark figure at the end of one of the rows, standing perfectly still facing us. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and he wore an old ragged coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. Thinking it was just one of the workers trying to scare us, I called out, "Nice costume, you really got us." But the figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there watching. "Let's go," Megan said, tugging at my arm. I laughed it off, trying to stay brave, but something about the figure's silence felt wrong. We turned back, moving quickly through the maze, hoping to shake off the unease. But as we made our way through the twisting paths, we kept seeing him, no matter which way we turned. He would appear at the end of a row, a dark silhouette framed against the moonlit cornstalks, his figure getting closer and closer each time. There was no way he could be moving so quickly. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. We started running, tripping and stumbling over the uneven ground. The cornstalks rustled around us like they were alive, bending and swaying to block our path. I could feel him getting closer, hear his footsteps right behind us, growing louder with each step. Just as we reached the edge of the maze, I turned back, only for a split second. He was standing there just a few feet away, his face still hidden under the hat, his hand reaching out toward us. We burst out of the maze and didn't stop running until we reached the car. When we finally caught our breath, we looked back at the maze, but he was gone. The next day, we told everyone what we'd seen. Most people didn't believe us, laughing it off as a prank or our imagination. But a few older locals pulled us aside and said, in hushed tones, that the maze had a history. Decades ago, a farmhand went missing in the cornfield, and his body was never found. Ever since, people claim to see him wandering the maze, looking for a way out. To this day, I refuse to go back, because every fall when the wind rustles the corn, I swear I can still feel his eyes on me, watching from somewhere deep within the maze. Growing up, my family's farm was bordered by an endless cornfield that stretched far beyond where the eye could see. The cornstalks towered high, swaying in the breeze, creating an eerie rustling sound that seemed to whisper as the wind passed through. It was easy to get lost in the maze of tall plants, and my parents always warned me never to go too far in, especially as the days grew shorter in October. But when you're a kid, rules are only meant to be tested. One late afternoon, my cousin Ben dared me to walk to the center of the field. "Just walk straight ahead," he said, grinning. "See if you can make it to the middle without getting scared." Eager to prove my bravery, I accepted the challenge, venturing into the field with only a flashlight and the sound of my own footsteps crunching on dry leaves. As I walked, the sounds of the world outside the corn grew fainter, swallowed by the endless rows of tall, whispering stalks. I must have walked for what felt like an hour when the sun began to set, casting strange shadows between the stalks. Suddenly, everything around me felt different. The air grew thick, and the corn seemed to close in, forming walls that left me feeling trapped. I turned to head back, but I couldn't find the path I'd taken. Every row looked identical. I called out for Ben, but my voice only echoed back, muffled by the dense walls of corn. Then, Just as the last bit of sunlight disappeared, I heard something strange. A faint whispering, barely louder than the rustling of the corn. It sounded like voices, soft and overlapping, speaking in words I couldn't understand. My heart pounded as I scanned the field with my flashlight. In the distance, I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the stalks, darting out of view the second I tried to focus on it. I could hear footsteps, soft and shuffling, coming closer, too quiet to belong to Ben, but too loud to be my imagination. Panicking, I started running, pushing through the corn, desperate to find the edge of the field. The whispers grew louder, rising to an eerie chant, surrounding me on all sides. I tripped and fell, my flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling a few feet away. When I reached for it, I felt a cold hand close around my ankle. I screamed, pulling myself free, scrambling to my feet as the whispering grew into a low, breathy laughter. I didn't look back. I just kept running, crashing through the corn until I finally burst out of the field and stumbled back onto the familiar ground of the farm. When I looked back, the corn was still, the laughter gone. But ever since that night, I swear I can hear the whispers on the wind every October, calling me back into the maze. And every year, the edge of the cornfield seems a little closer to our house, as if it's waiting for me to return. Growing up in a small town, the annual Harvest Festival was a big event, and the Cornfield Maze was the main attraction. People came from all around to get lost in the maze, especially during the harvest moon. The maze took on a different feeling at night, strange, almost alive. Local legends said that the maze was haunted by spirits tied to the land, especially on nights of the full moon. One year, my friends and I decided to sneak into the maze after it had closed for the night. It was a night like no other, with the full harvest moon casting an eerie orange glow over the fields. We crept through a gap in the fence and walked into the maze, laughing nervously. But as we ventured deeper, we began to notice that something felt off. The corn was taller than I'd ever seen, towering over us, and the pathways seemed narrower. The sound of our own footsteps and laughter felt muted, swallowed by the stalks around us. Suddenly we heard it, a soft rustling noise, as if someone else were moving through the maze just beyond the walls of corn. "Probably another group sneaking in," one of my friends whispered, though his voice betrayed his unease. We kept walking, ignoring the creeping feeling that we weren't alone. Then as we turned a corner, we saw a figure. It was tall and thin, with an old straw hat that cast a shadow over its face. It stood motionless in the center of the path, blocking our way. For a moment, I thought it was a scarecrow that had somehow fallen into the maze. But then it moved, slowly raising its head to reveal hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. We froze, too scared to breathe. The figure tilted its head, watching us, before disappearing into the corn without a sound. None of us could move as we processed what we'd just seen. But before we could speak, we heard whispers drifting through the stalks. "The harvest! The harvest!" I broke from my trance and turned, ready to bolt, but the path behind us was no longer there. The corn seemed to shift around us, forming walls that led us in circles. Panicked, we ran, but every turn led us back to the same spot. We kept hearing the whispers, growing louder, echoing all around us. Just as the moonlight faded behind a cloud, I felt a cold hand close around my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm back, turning to see the figure standing inches away, its face hidden by the shadows of its hat. Behind it, more figures emerged, each with the same empty, glowing eyes, moving toward us from all directions. Desperate, we pushed through the corn, running without looking back. The whispers and rustling grew louder, surrounding us until we finally burst out of the maze and onto the open field. We didn't stop running until we reached the road. The next morning, I found deep scratches on my arm where the figure had grabbed me. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, but every fall, when the harvest moon rises, I remember those empty eyes watching us in the maze.